Hey everyone, ZCrazyG here, and you know, I had one of those mornings where you wake up and think, how can I piss everyone off today? And then it hit me. Unpopular opinions. We all have them, those subjective views that we feel don't seem to conform to the view of the majority, and we dare not speak them lest people hunt me down for not liking Crash Bash. The thing is though, we can't deny, we all love hearing other people's terrible opinions. We may not agree with them and even downright hate them, but there's just something about them that we can't resist. And today, I'll be sharing 10 of what I consider my unpopular opinions regarding the Crash Bandicoot franchise, in no particular order. Just to put this forward though, this is just for some fun. When it comes to video games, we all have subjective and different views, so there's no need to get upset if someone else's opinion doesn't align with yours. And so with that, let's get this started, and we'll start off a little light. And given that the character of these games is a big part of them, let's focus my first unpopular opinion on one of its best characters. Its main villain, and how I think Lex Lang's version of Cortex is better than Clancy Brown's. Now, 3 different actors have portrayed the character in English versions of the game. The first, Brendan O'Brien in Crash 1 was honestly, he just kinda sounded like a generic, measly, angry, shouty man and not much else. When Clancy Brown came in for Crash 2 though, the character became a lot more defined. Clancy Brown is no stranger to playing villains, and he definitely managed to convey a sinister persona while remaining a bumbling failure. His performances in Crash 2 and Crash 3 were great. But then you get onto his later stints as Cortex. In Wrath of Cortex, I don't know, it definitely feels like there's such a lack of enthusiasm here. I don't know if it was the awfully generic script he had to work with, but his performance just seems lacking. But then you get to Nitro Kart, and my God, you can definitely tell he could not care less and is just phoning it in so much at this point. It's bad, honestly. But then you get Lex Lang, who debuted in Twinsanity, a game where the charm and wit is one of its biggest strengths, and at the center of that was his performance as Cortex. His take on Cortex was a lot more flamboyant and had so much energy behind it, even in the Titans games. And when it came to him doing Clancy Brown's lines in the Insane trilogy, while I don't think he could have ever pulled off the same sinister vibe as Clancy Brown, I think his Cortex may always be too rooted in a more comedic sense for that. He still did very well at playing the character more grounded and villainous, I think really solidifying him as the definitive Cortex. With Clancy Brown, while he had a great sense of character to begin with, it was obvious he wasn't passionate about his role in the later games, and his performance really reflects that. Whereas Lex Lang has always put a lot of energy and enthusiasm into the character, managing to portray him very well on both ends of the spectrum for Cortex. And hey, while we're talking about characters, let's talk about how I think Crunch isn't and never was a good character. I've seen so many people requesting Crunch to make a comeback in Crash 4, seeing as how they're kind of starting a new timeline with this one. And I have no issue with that, just as long as they have a good reason and way of reintegrating him into the story, and if he's actually a good character this time. Now, I think the initial concept of Crunch as a villain was actually really strong, since like Crash, he was an enhanced Bandicoot, but unlike Crash, he actually turned out evil. He's like a dark reflection of Crash, as if you were fighting the thing that you were meant to be, and that's a really cool approach. Though they didn't really go into that at all, and he wasn't really given any character or personality to back it up. He was just like, grr, I'm going to kill you. And when he did become a good guy, initially in Nitro Kart, he again had very little personality to him, just kind of being a straight-faced tough guy. And after that, oh dear God, he literally just became a walking punchline to the same damn joke that got real old real quickly. That he was just a dumb Mr. T parody. Granted, in this incarnation he did get a funny line or two when the script allowed it, but man, talk about wasted potential. I hope if he's ever brought back in the future, they expand upon him more, because God knows he deserved more than just being a one-note character. And while we're on the subject of notes, let's talk about music. and how I think the Wrath of Cortex has the best soundtrack in the entire franchise. Now this is such a close call because this series is home to so many fantastic soundtracks. Crash 1's moodier and atmospheric pieces, Crash 2's incredibly quirky and energetic tunes, Crash 3's more grand and melodic arrangement, and even Crash Twinsanity's more experimental and zanier take on the music. But personally, I think the Wrath of Cortex just edges them all out. The OST is composed by Andy Blythe and Martin Jostra, and if you have listened to any of their previous work, you'll know how damn good these guys are. With Wrath of Cortex, they seem to combine all the tones of the trilogy soundtracks, and it creates a vibe that, while not initially seeming like a Crash soundtrack, manages to fit the tone of each stage perfectly. And with each stage having its own unique track, that certainly helps with its variety. It can be upbeat, it can be quirky, it can be big and epic, or it can be dark and moody, and it just nails each one it goes for. No disrespect whatsoever for the genius works of Joshua Mansell by any means, but this soundtrack just absolutely crushes it, and it's one of Wrath of Cortex's best features. And you know what? Something else I think needs to be said about Wrath of Cortex is that it's by far not the worst of the franchise. Now, it's widely known that this game has developed a reputation for being apparently terrible and the very worst point in the series, and while I personally would struggle to call it a good game, I want to stand up for this one and say I think it's nowhere near as bad as everyone makes it out to be. Granted though, I can see why people don't like this game, and it's entirely justified, but I feel like the good aspects of the game really get shafted when people seem to talk about it. I've gone into more detail in my Wrath of Cortex review, but to sum up my thoughts on it briefly, I think the game is neither bad nor good, but rather a very painful average. For almost everything good it does something else bad. The platforming half the time feels like really good solid Crash platforming, but the other half it feels really lifeless, bland, and bafflingly worse than before. The vehicle levels, when given time and a larger scope to explore their concepts, turn out really fun and memorable, but for the rest of the time it just keeps throwing these concepts at you with very little thought behind them, only to then forget about them and move on to the next thing. It's really messy. It's completely understandable to see where the criticism comes from, but I just feel like its good merits are never even given much of a chance. And when you come to learn the backstory of its development, its shortcomings become a lot more understandable. And just being honest here, this series has seen far worse in its time. While I completely agree that Wrath of Cortex is definitely not up there with the OG trilogy, I can still respect the glimmers of gold it has, and I think it deserves a bit more recognition than is due. Now, if you want to know what I think the actual worst of the console lineup is, then let me tell you now that I think Crash Tag Team Racing is the worst of the console games. I used to play this game a ton when I first got my PSP ages ago, but after replaying it in more recent years, I just look back and wonder why the fuck was I such a masochist? I understand that there's plenty who like this game, and that's awesome, good for you guys, I'm glad you enjoyed it. But I'm sorry, I just think Tag Team Racing is dreadful. I suppose I'll begin with the racing. The driving mechanics are incredibly basic and unsatisfying to control. The clash mechanic, while initially really cool and with a ton of different combination possibilities, it loses its novelty very quickly when you realize just how overpowered you are. And the tracks, some of the most forgettable and uninspiring course designs in any racing game I have ever played. The races are just so boring, they are insanely dull with barely anything engaging to them. Then you got the platforming, because this game is of course a hybrid. Credit though, I do like the concept they go for with the racing theme park, but in reality the platforming, much like the racing, isn't really anything special, and while it has some good elements to it, for the most part I find it to be rather messy and all over the place if I'm being honest. Oh, and the frame rate during the overworld is utter arse. While I love the new characters they introduced, especially Von Clutch, he's a lot of fun, Crash-A-Thon, I just personally find tag team racing to be such a boring, unengaging snooze fest. Again, that's just my opinion, and I know that this game has its fans, but I honestly can hardly go back to it anymore. There's just nothing fun about it for me, with the exception of some new characters and occasionally some charming moments and funny dialogue from time to time. I don't know if I were to play through it entirely that I would maybe enjoy it a bit more, but for the playthrough I did while getting this gameplay, I could hardly get partway through the second world. It just did nothing for me. So how are we doing so far? Do you hate me yet? Nice, get ready to hate me more. But I'm not done with my thoughts on Crash racing games. Oh no, now onto something that might be extremely contentious. I think CTR Nitro Fueled's post-launch season could have been handled a bit better. Now please put your throwing bricks down and hear me out for a second. So it might seem strange that I'm saying something like this when I just made a video praising CTR to no end. And don't get me wrong, I adore this game, but I will still hold its flaws to account. And you may ask, how can you criticize the post-launch season? We got monthly content drops all for free. And yes, I don't deny that, and it was a very good post-launch season. I just think some things could have been done better. Firstly, the pacing of the Grand Prix. Now yes, the monthly Grand Prix kept adding content at a regular rate, but that's also a double-edged sword. With people wanting to earn everything from the Grand Prix, the more frequent content drops led to more items to grind for, which I personally think is what led to so many people becoming burnt out with the game only about 3 Grand Prix in. A bit more time between each one, I feel, would have perhaps kept the momentum of engagement up. Another thing, the abandonment of any further updates or features to the online. Now, I understand that the team has only so many resources, time, and people at their disposal to work on things like this, but I felt Beenox's focus solely on content left the online mode, the most popular and constantly played mode in the game, in a really rough state. If it was up to me, I actually wouldn't have minded maybe sacrificing a couple of the Grand Prix, if it meant that Beenox could have had more time to put towards fixing online and adding new modes to it to keep it interesting. I won't lie, I could have happily done without some of the weaker Grand Prix like Back in Time, Spyro and Winter Festival if that would have meant a better online experience overall. Alas, it was not to be, and hey, I still think the post-launch season was brilliant and I had tons of fun with it. And I will always love this remake regardless of its shortcomings. Speaking of remakes, there's all this talk in the community of wanting Crash Bash remade. And if I'm being honest, I don't think Crash Bash should be remade, but instead an entirely new party game. Now, when I did my review of Crash Bash, I was very clear about the fact that I didn't like it. I'm sorry. Granted, I was reviewing it from a single player perspective, which, given that it's a party game, is kind of pointless. The whole point of these games is that they are intended for a multiplayer experience first and foremost. Despite that though, I'll still stand by my criticisms of Bash. I still think that while the initial minigame concepts are really good, the lack of originality in just reusing them with such minimalistic tweaks as an excuse for more content is lazy. And that's mainly why I still don't like Bash as it is. And if it were to just get a remake in the same way that the Insane trilogy did by keeping the game as it was only with new graphical assets, that's not going to fix the game in the slightest. That's why I think they should start from scratch and create an entirely new game. I think the success of Super Mario Party and hell, even something like Fall Guys shows that there is 100% a place for minigame based online multiplayer games. I think the Crash series has so many great ideas that they could create so many new concepts for awesome minigames from. It could still invoke the same ideas and spirit as Crash Bash, but with an entirely new set of minigames to work with. I just think that way would be way more preferable to just a remake of Crash Bash as it is. And I sincerely hope that the rumoured Crash PvP game in the works could very well be that. I can't think of a way to transition to my next point, so I don't really like Crash 3's vehicle levels that much. Yeah, that's about it. To me, Crash Bandicoot is a platformer. The platforming is what the game is based on and built around. The idea of vehicle levels has always been ingrained into Crash from the very beginning. In the first 2 games, especially 2, the vehicles acted as a nice supplement to the platforming, appearing only every so often or even spliced within a platforming stage with well thought out and well designed gameplay. They provided a change of pace in the right way and gave these games variety without diverting from what made the games great, the platforming. Crash Bandicoot 3, in my opinion, does not do that, and it's one of the game's biggest drawbacks. The game introduces several vehicle stage types at once, and though it's not like Wrath of Cortex where they just throw in way too much half-assed vehicles one after the other, Crash 3 actually, to its credit, keeps it to a more restrained amount and gives its vehicles multiple stages each. It's just that I don't really like the majority of the vehicle stages here. The only ones I fully enjoy are the tried and true animal riding sections, and I think Crash 3's incarnation is the best they have ever been. The flying levels and the jet ski levels I can tolerate somewhat. I think they control fine, at least in the originals. I think the flying levels are way too brief, and I'm not a fan of the level design in the jet ski stages. The underwater levels I think are just really boring and too slow paced, and good fucking god, do not get me started on those motorbike stages. The worst levels of the original trilogy by far for me. They play like complete arse. But what makes it worse for me, seeing as I don't really like a lot of these, is that they make up half of the fucking level count in the game. They just engulf such an enormous portion, and I personally think that it does detract from the platforming. And that sucks, because Warp's platforming levels were some of the best of the series up to that point. Personally, I think Crash 2 hit the balance on the head, and that's the main reason I tend to like the second game compared to the third. But hey, enough talk of the older games, let's actually get a bit more topical with the upcoming Crash release, and how I actually think I might prefer Crash 4's art style compared to the Insane trilogy. Ever since Crash 4 was first revealed, the one thing about the game that has received a lot of contention from the fans was the way it looked, mainly the character designs. I guess people were just kinda used to the designs used in Insane and CTR by this point, so to have a change was understandably jarring. Personally though, I actually think the new style is much more suited to Crash. Now, it needs to be stated, graphics and art style are two separate things. Just because I prefer Crash 4's style does not mean I don't like Insane's visuals. In fact, I think the Insane trilogy looks fantastic. Granted though, it doesn't really have a defined sense of art direction. I guess it just goes for a kind of pseudo-realistic style. And for what it was, I think it looked great and did the job. And I think that that style was pushed to its maximum in Nitro Fueled with the rich level of environmental detail in that game. However, what I think makes Crash 4's more preferable is that it has a much more defined style. And above all else, it conveys the personality of the series a lot better. I know it may be very presumptuous, but based on everything we've seen so far, it just oozes way more charm and personality with its more wild animations and quirkier designs, which I think is more truer to the original intention of Crash's character, in that it's meant to convey the vibe of classic Warner Brothers cartoons. With this more cartoony and animated style, you can exude so much more in the expressions and body language. And I'll be honest, I was never too sure about how some of the characters looked in the Insane style. Characters like Tiny, Dingodile, and hell, even Entropy to an extent felt a little bit off and restricted with the more realistic tone to their look, but maybe that's just me. When I sit back though and look at them both and think, which one of these feels more like Crash Bandicoot? I have to give it to Crash 4 here. It's a wonderfully stylized and fresh take while also staying true to these characters' designs. And so to round things off and to give the Insane trilogy a bit more positivity, I want to share with you what I consider my most unpopular Crash Bandicoot opinion. I think the Insane trilogy controls fine and is probably the best way to experience the original games. Oh, I can practically hear the seething from so many others right now. But let me explain. Let's start with the controls.
I don't know if I'm just playing a different game to everyone else, but I thought that the game's controls were fine. I found Crash to have a defined weight, but not heavy or dragging, and the jumping and slide jumping is snappy and slick. Yes, Crash's jump arc falls a lot faster, but it's nowhere near like Crash 1 where you feel like you're heavier than a damn bulldozer. If anything, in comparison to the original Crash 1, the controls are a vast improvement. In the other two, the changes to his jumping can make platforming a little bit more precise and a bit more challenging, but is that really such a bad thing? I still feel in control of Crash at all times. He feels smooth and responsive. And more so than anything, having the same control style across all three games makes it feel more consistent and easier to go from one game to another. The only time I felt the controls were butchered were with the jet ski in Crash 3. Holy shit, this is a mess. But overall, I think it's an absolutely solid recreation of the original trilogy. Crash 1 is by far better than it ever was, and Crash 2 and 3 are more or less the same as they always were. Despite a few visual oddities here and there, I think the games still look great, and the control style makes for a consistent experience across all three games. And in the end, you're getting a collection of great modern recreations of three fantastic games for 30 quid. That's a solid ass deal. I think the Insane trilogy is really damn good, and whenever I want to experience the original games, due to their modernized bells and whistles, and just for the sake of sheer convenience, I will always come back to the Insane trilogy personally. Also, just to make you hate me more, I play it with an analog stick. God, I'm sinful.
And so those are my unpopular Crash Bandicoot opinions, and I would encourage everyone else to share theirs as well. In the end, things like this are subjective, and there's no right or wrong way to talk about things like video games. So go on, share your heinous opinions down below. I'm not liable for any hate you may receive. And with that, thank you guys all so much for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe if you feel like it, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care, guys. Oh, that's a Molotov cocktail.